We're at the top of page 16. It's 11:30. His pride soaring, Jonathan grinned at his friend, who was looking at him with astonishment. Then Jonathan turned toward the innkeeper, who was standing by the door. "Going, are you?" the tavern keeper said before Jonathan could speak. "Yes, sir." "Got asked special, did you?" Jonathan nodded yes. "What's your father to say?" "Told me to come." "Did he?" Jonathan didn't say. "And now," said the tavern keeper, "our blessed corporal asked to borrow a gun. I can use it." "Hope you can," said the tavern keeper. He moved inside, saying, "Come on." Jonathan bounded up the stairs. It was dark inside. The wooden floorboards, shiny from heavy use, glowed with a dark brown warmth. The rank smell of ale and cider thickened the air. Waiting just inside the door, Jonathan kept his eyes on the far end of the large, dim room, where the white glow of the keeper's shirt moved behind the grill. Within moments, the man emerged from the dark, a gun in his hand. It was a flintlock musket, almost 6 feet long, butt and stock of polished wood. Jonathan saw that it was older than his father's gun, but to him it was nothing less than beautiful. Reaching out with one hand, he put his fingers around the cold metal barrel. It was unexpectedly heavy. He had to thrust out his other hand to keep it up. Holding it tightly, he brought the gun close to his chest, then let it swing down till the butt rested on the floor. The gun reached above his head. "Manage?" the tavern keeper asked. "Yes, sir," said Jonathan. "Sure, I can. It's 12 pounds of weight." Jonathan studied the gun, from its topmost ramrod to its shiny hammer lock to its bottom butt plate. Knowing the gun was his to use, he felt a deep glow inside. "Have I got your word of honor? You'll bring it back?" "Yes, sir." "Your honor as a man?" Okay, so at this point I want you to stop and take a sticky. The tavern keeper is questioning Jonathan's ability or permission to participate in this battle that the corporal's convincing them to go on. What is some evidence that shows that the tavern keeper is doubtful of Jonathan's participation? So I want you to start the sentence again as a complete sentence. The question, the words are right in the question. You would say, the tavern keeper is doubtful of Jonathan's participation as shown when he... Top of page 18. Yes, sir. The tavern keeper strung a cartridge pouch around the boy's neck. 30 cartridges, he said. Wrapped them myself. Here's your powder. He added the powder horn. Any extra flint? Jonathan asked, wanting to show he understood what he was about. What I've got to spare is on the gun. The tavern keeper kept studying Jonathan, measuring him. Look here, he finally said. You don't have to go. You can leave all this and get on out through the back. No one's going to know or care. Not that man. Just because he's tapped you doesn't mean you have to go. He likes telling folks what to do. Jonathan, not even wanting to hear the words, looked down. He fingered the gun nervously. You know much about him? The tavern keeper asked. Jonathan shook his head no. The tavern keeper considered. Then he sighed. You take care of yourself, he said. For a moment Jonathan remained standing there, not knowing what to say. Get on then, if you're going, the man said with a wave of his hand. Get! Jonathan turned, inadvertently smashing the gun butt against the door frame. The shock made him almost drop the gun. Recovering, he hastened outside into the light. The men had already begun to move south along the Pennington Road. The corporal, astride his horse, was rounding past the bend. Jonathan looked about. Behind him from the building's darkness the tavern keeper watched, while in front of his friend sat on the bell rack frame, hands to either side. He too was watching. Grasping the gun tightly in both hands, Jonathan jumped down the steps and ran down the road toward Pennington. 12:05. The gun was heavy. Jonathan tried throwing it over his shoulder and resting it as the others did, only to find its weight cut into his back. He had to use both hands and carry it across his chest. He didn't like the notion that he was the only one who held his gun that way. Still, He had no choice. There were the cartridge box and powder horn, too. They kept thumping against his legs, the straps having been cut for a tall man. When they clattered over the first wooden bridge south of the crossroads, Jonathan was still far behind. A little farther on came another bridge. He saw the corporal had called a stop before they crossed it, and from his horse he was talking to the men. Hurrying, Jonathan ran to catch up, but missed the first part of what had been said. "At least that's my figuring," he heard the corporal say. "It couldn't be helped. But we can stop them if we stomach enough. They won't think we'll try." "How many do you think there'll be?" called a man. Jonathan, on the outer fringe of the group, strained to listen, glad to be able to rest his gun on the ground. 20, 25, came the corporal's off-handed reply. His words were met with uneasy silence. Jonathan, sensing that something was wrong, looked around. "Before, you said that there weren't more than 15, came an angry voice. "Did I?" said the corporal coolly. "Then I misspoke myself." Again, save for the shifting feet of the men, there was a silence. Jonathan noticed how nervous they were. It hadn't occurred to him that they would be. "Does 5 or more turn you about?" the corporal asked. Jonathan looked from face to face, waiting for a reply. He saw downcast eyes, furtive and unsure. Then someone said, "I want to hear again, what brought them out? You said the Committee of Public Safety, aside from yourself. How many were there?" The corporal's face turned redder. "Ask them," he snapped. "Here," came a tense voice. "We didn't elect you, corporal. Sitting on a horse don't make you so damn high." "How, you can choose for yourself," came the return, and angrily the corporal swung down from his horse. "I just beg you gentlemen to make it fast. While you're holding your Congress, they're coming closer. Who will ye have?" Jonathan watched the shifting eyes. No one said a word. No one looked directly at the corporal. "Then, by God," the corporal snapped, "I'll be your man. Is that your silent meaning?" Jonathan, trying to understand what was happening, saw the men shift about. No one spoke a word. They seemed cowed. Quickly the corporal remounted. "Come on, then," he said. "We need to get to Rocktown before they do. We can ambush them from the trees if that's your pleasure." The notion of an ambush rather than an open fight cheered the men. Jonathan saw the tension ease. A few men grinned. Turning his horse, the corporal moved on toward the bridge. The men followed briskly. Jonathan gathered up his gun and hurried after. For himself, he was glad the corporal led them. He thought him a strong, forceful man. Okay, so on a couple of stickies. The first one, I want you to talk about visually how the author paints Jonathan as a young man, that he might not be prepared to go to war. There's some description in relationships to the weapon that the innkeeper gives to him. So on the sticky, you would start your sentence with, "You can tell Jonathan isn't prepared for war physically," when the author says something like that. Or you can make a note that you can tell Jonathan is too small or little for war, and then talk about how the author describes him in relation to the gun that he's using. On the second sticky, I want you to write down some notes on the corporal. And the question basically is, how can you tell that the corporal is a forceful man? Jonathan's personally impressed by this, but what do you think? The corporal seems to be forceful for a reason. So I want you to write down some evidence that the corporal might be pushing the men to do what he wants. Page 22, 12:30. When they crossed over the second bridge, the road began to rise. The pace slowed. Some of the men were breathing hard. Jonathan, with a sudden burst, caught up. For a while he walked along with a man he knew to be his father's friend, a large man. He was already perspiring. His bald head was bright and wet. A fringe of whitened hair dripped sweat. "What's it about?" asked Jonathan, taking a step and a half to match each of the strides of the bigger man. The man gave Jonathan a quick look as if surprised to see him there. Instead of giving an answer, he said, "What are you doing here?" "Going to fight," said Jonathan. "I heard there were enemy troops, 15, 20 or so. Where are they going? What are they trying to do? Something happen?" The man studied Jonathan, then turned and spat on the ground. "Didn't you hear?" he asked. "Just what I said." The man sucked a deep breath and marched in heavy silence, waiting for an answer. Jonathan did his best to keep up. Suddenly the man said, "Why'd you come?" "What?" "Why'd you come, I asked you." Jonathan searched for words. "Wanted to," he said. "Your father know? Give permission?" "Yes, sir," said Jonathan, half swallowing his words. "How's his leg?" "Still poor. Maybe he's better off," said the man. Then he said, "You sure he sent you?" Jonathan, feeling uncomfortable, let the man move on ahead. The man didn't look back, but continued to march on. Once more Jonathan allowed himself to drop to the rear, deciding it was better to stay last. As he started to march again, however, he realized his father's friend hadn't replied to his questions. The thought came to him, perhaps he didn't have the answers. Okay, so on a sticky, I want you to take some notes. The author is doing some foreshadowing here. You can tell that there's a build-up to something that might go poorly. What are some signs that if you were in Jonathan's place, you might start to become a little nervous? Again, complete sentences. Start with, I would become nervous if I were Jonathan when... 1240, page 24. When the road reached the top of a ridge, they paused once more. It was hotter, much more humid. Jonathan scanned the sky, noticing clouds building to the west. Even though they hadn't gone long, some of the men threw themselves on the ground as if exhausted. Others sprawled against trees. Most removed their hats. Some fanned themselves. The corporal alone seemed anxious to get on. Atop his horse, he kept his eyes on the road ahead. Jonathan rested by a tree. His legs weren't tired, but his arms ached. He placed his gun against the tree and studied where they were. Off to one side of the ridge he could see a small meandering creek and two small ponds that fed it. Thick woods stood beyond the pond. Farther on, perhaps half a mile, were more high hills. To the south it was also high and heavily wooded. Jonathan could see where the road ran south and climbed again. At the highest point, only a little way beyond, was Rocktown, where they were going to fight. He looked back and took measure of the clouds. A storm was coming, a big one. He gazed about again. It was quiet. He could hear no birds, not even the men were talking, nor was there any wind, not the smallest hint of a breeze. The leaves on the trees, spring new and Kelly green, hung limp. Such birds as there were flew too high. The stillness made him uneasy, as it was as if nothing was allowed to move but themselves, rushing on to what, he was not sure. Okay, so the author uses a description of the land and what's going on in their surroundings to also give another piece of foreshadowing. Foreshadowing is like a hint the author's giving you. So what about the description about Jonathan's surroundings makes him uneasy? Near the bottom of page 25. Suddenly aware that his heart was beating fast, he felt a great need to know what was happening and what he had to do, but he was afraid of the kinds of questions his father's friend had asked. He didn't want to be noticed too much. They might send him home. Reluctantly, he decided he would just have to wait and learn by watching the others. 12:50. "Corporal!" someone called. "Where's your Snydertown folks?" Jonathan had heard of Snydertown. He believed it was 3 miles somewhere to the east, but wasn't sure. He was already farther from his home than he'd been in many months. "They joined us? They joining us?" someone else threw in. Jonathan could see from the way the men were watching that these were important questions. "Wouldn't be fair for us to do their work," added another. The corporal shifted slowly and gazed stony-faced down the road. Some of the men looked knowingly at one another. "We going or not?" asked the corporal. He spoke without looking back. "You've got a reputation for being overfond of killing," someone said. "That ever reach your ears?" That time the corporal turned. "Sir," he said, evenly, "if they do come, it'll be your home they'll burn as well as mine." No more words were spoken. Instead, slowly the men came to their feet. The corporal urged his horse forward. Silently the men followed. So did Jonathan. But he saw that once again the men had grown uneasy. In the face of the man who had last spoken he thought he recognized the same look his father had had when they parted. Fear. Okay, so on a sticky I want you to write down some more notes. What is some evidence that the corporal is avoiding something? What makes you think that the corporal may have something to hide?